Okay, here we are. One more time. It must be Tuesday. It must be magical realism. Life is speeding by. What I want to do is finish Borges today. Even though our syllabus shows that we're on to Carpentier, we will get to him by the end of the class, I hope, and read his 1949 essay on Lo Real Maravilloso, his way of saying magical realism. Well, there are distinctions that we're going to be making between his term and the one that we've been using so far. But I wanted first to link the artist Jules Solar, that's X-U-L-S-O-L-A-R, as you know, Jules Solar, to Borges. And the reason I want to do that, you've seen Jules Solar's work in the museum. He's included in the Inverted Utopias exhibition. He was an avant-garde painter. Let me tell you a little bit about him. His birth date is something like 9 years before Borges, so I didn't check to make sure, but something like 1889. Oh, I wish I had checked, but it's about right. His mother was Lithuanian and his father was Italian. The name Jules, X-U-L, is an assumed name. His first name was, I think, Alexander. I should have checked these details. I'm sorry. I'll fill in the details for you. His last name, his father was Italian. The last name was Solari, and he made it into Solar. He came back from Europe having spent about 20 years there in 1925. And he came back to Buenos Aires, where he had been born. His parents were recent immigrants to Argentina. And he met the young writer Jorge Luis Borges, and they were friends until the time of Jules Solar's death in 1963, if I'm not mistaken. Borges lived on till 1989. He lived to be a very old man. But when I actually went to Buenos Aires to do research on Jules Solar, when I realized they were friends, and when I saw the work, and I said, goodness, there are some similarities between Borges and Jules Solar. So I went to the museum, and I went to a number of places that Borges I've made famous, coffee shops where he would hang out in Buenos Aires. And then I went to the National Museum of Art, and there in the bookstore was a CD-ROM, a stack of CD-ROMs of Borges talking about Jules Solar and what a wonderful artist he was. And Borges, when he would talk, I'll play it for you if you're interested, or if anybody is interested in doing Jules Solar, I'll certainly make available my stuff to you. And it might be fun to cite some of what Borges says, of course in Spanish, about Jules. But mainly he goes on and on about what a wonderful friend he was and how he had such a creative imagination and so forth. But and in fact, there are details in Borges's work in Clone, Ukbar, and Orbis Tertius where he refers to the kind of language. Remember those funny little letters in that where he's talking about the language of Clone? And he's using a concept that Jules developed. Jules spoke a funny language. He wanted everyone to speak the same language, and so he developed what he called universal code or something, yes, PAN something. In fact, the group that supports the museum, which is his house on La Prida Street, which we saw last time, the group, they're called the PAN Club with a K-L-U-B. But you remember the funny chess set that was in the show, if you saw that, and so forth. Well, let me just show you some more images of Jules and say a few things, as I try to do when I show you pictures, that will help us, I hope, understand magical realism better, or at least the writers that we're seeing. This first one, you'll see, oops, Phil's going to pull it down for us so you can see the title. It's not Spanish, it's not English, it's Fluctúa nave sierpe por la extensión y su cornaque. Now, I can't tell you what that means because I don't speak the universal code or whatever it was, the language that was invented. My book says that it says something about the nave is a word, of course, meaning ship. You'll see he puts his words on the painting itself, but I'll give you a translation of that if you want, according to what one of his critics says. But what's going on here? He's very big into a handful of metaphors, just the same way that Borges was. He always painted small format. small format being probably 2 feet by 3 at the most, even less, 2 by 1.5, something like that. Always in watercolor. He never really did much in oil at all, and he would always do this kind of whimsical landscape with letters floating, with pieces of things floating in the air. Start to think, if you will, of the Aleph that Borges's character sees in the basement of his friend's house in Buenos Aires. This is an interesting one in particular because of the words Tlaloc. We've seen Tlaloc, I believe, in this class. It's the Aztec god of rain. We see agua, of course, and then we see atl down in the left-hand corner, our left-hand corner, and atl means water in Nahuatl, in the Aztec language. And so what we're taking this to be, I think we can read it as a picture of the rain god Tlaloc with what look like waves and perhaps fish in a kind of fluid, idealized world where we can say, well, is this magical realism? I think it's more like Klee and Kandinsky. If you know the history of art, Paul Klee, K-L-E-E, and Kandinsky, who were expressionists, not post-expressionists or magical realists. But still, there's something, at least we can agree, that's fantastical about this image. Here's another one called Civitas. He, like Magritte, loved to give his paintings titles that don't seem to have too much to do with anything. Civitas would be, I suppose, the city or civilization or the civilized. There's a kind of, doesn't mean any of those in particular. But what do we do then with a fellow like this, or like this, Lady Diaphanous, this is called? Well, here we can make some sense of it, can't we? Because she seems transparent. Diaphanous means, if you speak of diaphanous material, it means gauzy, floating. And so here we can make something. There's again the serpent, but we see her inner workings there. We see her heart, her breasts, her stomach, it would seem. But again, with this kind of non-place, this kind of imaginary space which is everywhere and nowhere. He likes to do little landscapes. I'll show you some more. I'm showing you a series first of his people. Chief of serpents. He likes to use the word serpent and dragon quite a lot. Jefe, you see down there in the lower left-hand corner, the word for chief, I suppose, or boss, jefe. And then of serpents with, of course, the serpents. And again, this kind of geometricized non-space that suggests everywhere or nowhere, or we say, why are we even trying to read this as a realistic space at all? It's a painted space. It calls attention to its own artifice. It's flat. Remember, realistic painting from the Renaissance forward has a vanishing point. It seems to have distance. It has perspective. None of that here. It's flattened out. It's a painted surface with these kinds of floating pieces on them. And another man of snakes. The colors are delicious. I hope they're a little brighter up there than perhaps they should be. It's hard to tell, but unfortunately, when I went to his museum in Buenos Aires, I thought that it would be, it's called the House Museum because it's where he lived, and I thought it would be like a cozy house with, you know. No, it's been super modernized. It's kind of a cement bunker inside. But what's neat about having all these cement walls is that you look down into the space of exhibition and you see the colors so magnificently against the gray of the cement, illuminated. He was a great colorist, as you can see from these examples. Here we have a couple. Think of Borges and I, that story which we'll get to after we see our pictures. You know, the number 2, the letter B, I'm not sure. There's a 6 up there too, so that's kind of a funny thing when you have a couple, but he's playing here with the representation, highly stylized. expressionist painter of a couple. So if you know Picasso, and who doesn't, there's a little something Picasso-esque about his paintings as well. That nose that may be shared by both of them. Whose is that lavender nose? It could be his, hers. That distortion of the Albertian or Renaissance perspective that we've seen already with our trompe-l'oeil paintings. And septuplet, I'm showing you all of the people ones together. 7 faces, indeed, if you count them up, or masks, as they seem to be, some of them detached from bodies. So again, this parts-whole problem that I talked about when I talk about the Aleph as a synecdoche for the universe, the parts that stand for the whole. There's something universalizing about these small format watercolor paintings that if they were oil and more realistic, they would be more like the realistic novel that Borges also attempted and successfully to avoid throughout his whole life. I've mentioned that several times. He says about the Scarlet Letter, it's a nice there are a few nice passages in the Scarlet Letter, but it's the short magical stories. Borges wanted to stay away from realism. How do you do it? By not writing novels or painting large format oil paintings, though you can still avoid realism with large format oil too. Here, despareja, unequal, and I suppose this is a reference to that short fellow. Again, notice the space that's cut up into geometrical slices and pieces. Somehow these paintings are about space and the nature of our filling space, our occupying space as human beings, as well as filling the space of the canvas. And so that does resonate for me with the kinds of worlds created within the worlds of the stories of Borges, a kind of idealized world. Una drola. Now you don't say that in Spanish. I didn't translate it, but it's something about a droll or a troll. Look at the eyes in the middle of the painting. It's as if someone is looking out, at least one eye, looking out at us, but then there seems to be a mouth, 3/4 of the way down, something like an odd self there looking out through the Venetian blinds or through bolts of material, through lines painted on the paper. 3 and a serpent, you start to get the idea here of these kinds. His style never really evolves. He paints and paints and paints. He writes a lot too. He wrote a great deal. He did chess sets. He did a piano. He was muy curioso, as we would say. Curioso means curious. It also means, if not odd, it means an inquiring mind. So he was always tinkering, but never really transformed. You can't say, like with Picasso, when you study Picasso, there are 5 periods. There's the blue period where he really changes so much from one decade to another, but not Schul. Mystics, you see the worshippers here with crosses, the church down in the bottom. So it's not that we can't read these paintings, we can, but they're certainly not realistic. And again, look at what he does with space. He foreshortens. Even though this is meant to seem like people on lots of mountaintops and it seems like there's infinity, it's in teeny format and foreshortened perspective, so that it's almost as if the space stops with the space of the canvas, again like trompe-l'oeil. So this is a kind of trompe-l'oeil. It pretends to be a magnificent vista of people on pedestals or mountains or something, and yet that's subverted by the structure of the space itself. You see how he loves to do this? Now we have another kind of thing. He has another series of. So you see in the thematics there, the serpent, the selves that are separating, multiplying, if you want, converging, as in the case of the couples. And now we're going to see several examples of his walls and stairs and mountains. And again, these vistas. Someone said about Borges that who was it? Was it you, Catherine, that Escher comes to mind? Who said that? Somebody, or Ruth? Ruth said that. Here, Escher comes to mind, if you know the work of Escher, who does those little staircases that never end. And do you have a vision of Escher? So this is somewhat similar. Another one here. When we read the postscript to Tlon Uqbar and Orbis Tertius, one critic takes that moon up there in our upper right-hand corner and makes it seem as if that's what's being described when he describes the compass. I think it's Borges. I think it's stretching it, but all of these paintings come from the 20s and 30s when Borges was working on his craft. And in fact, as I said, the experimental language of Tlön is taken from Jules Solar's experimental language, and for a while he mentioned Jules Solar by name in that story, but Borges constantly revised his stories, and at one point he took out that reference. I saw that when I saw an earlier Spanish, then I looked at the English translation and I said, what happened? Did the translator take this out, this reference to Jules Solar, out of the English? And then I checked with people who know more than I do about Borges, and they said, no, Borges himself took it out at a certain point. He was constantly fiddling, not so much revising the individual stories as fiddling with the volumes. So there'd be a re-edition of an edition that had come out of the stories 3 or 4 years earlier, and he'd stick in some stuff, new stuff, but then the volume is still dated 4 years earlier, and so there's an odd anachronism there that you can be very fooled by. And I was actually thinking that an essay was written in 1932, but it was actually written in 1942, but he put it into that volume when it was re-edited 10 years later, republished. Here's another one of these Escher-like constructions, and I would say Borgesian constructions. Remember the Library of Babel? I mean, this would do as a cover illustration for that story, I think. We'd have to make the towers hexagonal instead of conical, but nonetheless, it's a kind of space imagined by those distant, teeny people there on that archway is the kind of space imagined and described in the Library of Babel. Yeah, Catherine, put your button, will you?
I just want to know the name of the painting.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to go right back. This one, City and Abysses. I realize that's teensy print. Thank you for asking. City and Abysses. Then Celestial Landscape. Again, these odd beings, that person down in the front foreground, well, these people, there are several of them. But again, what interests me is the infinite space in a tiny medium. That idea that it is possible to either describe or depict, in the case of paintings, infinity. This is meant, celestial landscapes, this is meant to be a trompe-l'oeil for the cosmos, just as the Aleph is also a trompe-l'oeil for the cosmos. So this kind of cosmic universalizing, idealizing vision seems to me to be shared by the two artists, Borges and Jules Solar. Here we have trunks. How he loved those little snakies. There's one down there in the bottom, as you see. One coming out of the trunk, it seems, in the middle of the picture there. And then he has another little subcategory, which we're starting here, which are these kinds of mythic cityscapes or mythic constructions. This is called Project Facade Delta. And it seems to be built on water. As you know, the Rio Plate is so wide at Buenos Aires, where it's about ready to empty into the Atlantic, that you can't see the other side of the river. You think you're on the ocean when you're in Buenos Aires, so wide is the river. So the river and the delta of the Rio Plate is an issue. So we see here something of the local circumstances. Oh, I the 80. Now, why did I put him down here? He should have gone up above. I love his little mustache, his yo, I the 80. It's written there. But these pieces of self that we've already seen. Colors are divine. Then he has another little category. I say he didn't develop. He didn't develop his medium. He has a handful of metaphors that he keeps working and working and working, as Borges does. There's a series called Graphia, which again doesn't quite mean anything, but it suggests scribbling or writing, obviously, graphics. And they're these kinds of things, less realistic than anything we've seen so far, in that we see people, we see figures in the earlier ones. Here we see designs. Another graphia, well, this one has people, so I take it back. It looks like celestial landscape that we saw a minute ago. Here's another graphia. This is the year before his death. They seem almost like doodles. There's something doodle-ish about the graphias, the late graphias, but there they are. I don't have the dates. I'm showing you this one and one more. 4 hybrid airplanes and city. Again, a sense of doodling about this work. I like the hybrid airplane with the anchor in the front right. It's obviously a cross between an airplane and a boat in a fantastical mode. The cityscape is still there, the buildings, the airplanes taking off from the tops of the buildings. And then 2 hybrid airplanes and people. He seemed to, as I say, this curioso side, this, I would say, Rube Goldberg side, if that means anything, the person who likes to invent machinery where it has no purpose other than its own complex structure, a little ball that runs from here to there, or something over a complex mechanical structure. He seemed to be interested in that kind of thing, as you can see. But these are basically like children's drawings in a lot of ways. And there we are back to the beginning. So let me I'll close this down, and we can get on with our discussion. First, any comments or questions? Does this seem far-fetched to you to think about Borges in these terms? Does it interest you? You did see the work in the museum, correct? Can anybody tell me? I showed one, at least I know, was there, which, remember the Tlaloc was there? And I think that's the only one of these that you've just seen that was in the show. I have my catalog with me. In fact, if you want to see it, William, come and borrow it later. I'll have to look and see, but it's the Tlaloc that I know for sure was in the Museum of Fine Arts, so you got to see one of the real things. Okay, let's continue on with our investigation of Borges. We still have several stories that I feel honor bound to at least go through a bit with you. Let's start with, speaking of handfuls of metaphors, let's go to the fearful sphere of Pascal on page 183. Is that right, 183? No, it's not right. What did I write down? Where's the fearful sphere of Pascal? Does anybody have it? I wrote it down wrong.
189.
189, thank you. Okay, this, just because we are under time pressure, let me just say a couple words about this story. Let me get my glasses so I can look at it. This is one of these think pieces, these metaphysical musings that Borges is so fond of. It's not plotted in any way, in my view. It's not like some of the ones we've seen, like The Garden of Forking Paths or The Death in the Compass, where there's actually a plot, a detective story, in fact. But here what we have is a contemplation of one of those metaphors that fascinates him, and it's the sphere, which is all the world. Well, we're going to see the list, but let's just start and see what he says. This is one of, he begins and ends this story with this famous line that I keep speaking over and over to you. It may be that universal history, top of 189, the beginning of the story, it may be that universal history is the history of a handful of metaphors. The purpose of this note will be to sketch a chapter of this history. And the chapter is this sphere. Now he just starts to list, and really the whole story is a list of different examples that vary somewhat this metaphor. But why Pascal? Because Pascal uses the metaphor. Now who is Pascal? Anybody bother to look up Pascal? Thanks, William. Yeah.
Was he a mathematician?
He was a mathematician who he was a kind of genius, and he was a mathematician to begin with, but he's known to the world. He's 17th century French. He's known to the world because he left a bunch of fragmentary thoughts that his heirs collected. He was also a clergyman, a very religious man, or at least he wasn't a clergyman, but he was part of a lay order. So he thought about very big thoughts in little pieces. Those pieces to this day are called thoughts. They were collected under that title, but if you don't know that title, you might know the title in French, which is pensées, les pensées. And it's often in English that keeps its French title, or people, when speaking about him in English, don't refer to thoughts. They speak of Pascal's pensées. And of course, being a good little doer of my homework, once I read this story, I went to the Pascal's Pensées, and there you find all sorts of tremendous speculation and worry about the nature of infinitude and the nature of the infinitesimal. Pascal, this is the beginning of the 17th century when microscopes and telescopes, and it's the time of Galileo, it's the time that the world is crashing down around everyone's head. So that's the big time for trompe-l'oeil. What is space? How do we occupy space? And so if you are interested at all in pursuing this question, it now seems to us old-fashioned. We're used to thinking of infinity. Of course, we're used to sending rockets to Mars, or wherever it was lately, the Hubble telescope to which one? Pluto? Where? I can't remember, one of those. But I mean, we take it now absolutely automatically. But at the beginning of the 17th century, the time that Pascal is writing, he's considering what is man and what is the relation. That closed dome of the sky is no longer closed, it's no longer understandable, and so forth. So it's a kind of moment of the consideration of these questions. So we go through a number of them, and then we come to the end, and we come up to Pascal. Now this is going to remind you of a line that was in italics that we've already seen in the Library of Babel, which sounds exactly like this, or similar to this, and my idea is that Borges has added to this history, or this chapter in the history of this handful of metaphors, with his own line in the Library of Babel. So it's kind of fun to hear the echo here, but let's just start at the top of 192. Very top. In that dispirited century, the 17th century he's referring to, I love the Baroque, and the doubts produced by the new science led to great achievements as well as dispiritedness. But anyway, we'll take his word. In that dispirited century, the 17th, the absolute space which had inspired the hexameters of Lucretius, the absolute space which had meant liberation to Bruno, became a labyrinth and an abyss for Pascal. He abhorred the universe and would have liked to adore God, but God for him was less real than the abhorred universe. He deplored the fact that the firmament did not speak, and he compared our life with that of castaways on a desert island. He felt the incessant weight of the physical world. I think Borges does too. I think Borges knows of what he speaks here. He felt the incessant weight of the physical world. He experienced vertigo, fright, and solitude, and he put his feelings into these words. And now we get his version of this metaphor. Nature is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Now, if you really try to visualize that, maybe you're better than I am, but it's hard to visualize an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. It would seem then it's no longer a sphere because you have to have a center and a circumference. But he's trying to think about the world, this new world where the infinite and the infinitesimal are newly available, first time available to human conception. Okay. Thus do the words appear in the Brunswick's text, but the critical edition published by Tourneur, Paris, 1941, Borges the bibliophile, Borges the bookworm. The critical edition published by Tourneur, Paris, 1941, which reproduces the crossed-out words and variations of the manuscript, reveals that Pascal started to write the word effroyable, a fearful sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. And then he repeats his modest, huge statement. It may be that the universal history is the history of the different intonations given a handful of metaphors. Okay, let's just turn and see Borges's edition of his own version of this metaphor. We'll find it in the library of Babel, and I didn't mark the page, so let me look for it, and you do too. Does anybody, what is it?
51.
Thank you so much. I was waffling around on the 40s here. Thank you. 51 is where it starts, and let's look at 52, where in the middle of the page we have this italicized sentence. He's playing with the same metaphor that he has outlined through the centuries for us in 3 pages. The library is a sphere whose exact center is any one of its hexagons and whose circumference is inaccessible. So it's a nice play if you want. We say, so what? Okay, so what? Does this tell us anything about our real lives? I don't know. Does it tell you anything about your real life? I love Borges. I love the metaphysical musings. I like his research methods. It's interesting to think of tracing such a metaphor over centuries and centuries, and he's done the reading that he needs to in order to do so. So that's the long and short of the fearful sphere of Pascal. We have the others that we have left to talk about are really more plotted, but let's, The Death in the Compass, I think I can count on you to have read. What happens? The detective is outsmarted by the criminal. It's a nice turning on its head of the Sherlock Holmes story. If anybody's interested in detective stories, Borges writes a couple or 3 of them. He wrote that story in 1941 in honor of Edgar Allan Poe's detective stories written in 1841, Murder in the Rue Morgue, The Purloined Letter, and something else. I can't remember the other one. He wrote 3 short detective stories in 1941 in homage to his precursor, Poe, whom he said, he invented the detective story, which indeed he did. Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie and all the rest come a great deal later. So it's The Death in the Compass. Can I count on you to have that one? Or anybody want to ask a question? Look at it. It's an ironic look at reason. We see this very rational detective who is out-reasoned by his quarry. So it's a kind of reversal of the detective story. Is everybody okay with that? Anybody want to do more with that story? I'll let that go because I think some of the others are harder that we still have to do. Let's look at Pierre Menard, page 36, please. What goes on in this? This is another one of these that you have to make yourself sit down because and go through it. I think it pays they're so short for one thing. If you had to do hundreds of pages of this kind of ironic bibliography, you'd have to stop. But what is this about? This is about a Frenchman who decides he's going to write Don Quixote. But how can he do that? It's already been written. And he knows that perfectly well. He read it many years before. Remember, Don Quixote, 1605, and the second volume is 1615. So we're talking about a modern French writer. It's set in the present day, who wants to recreate a early 17th century masterpiece. To do so, he must forget first that he has read it. He must forget everything about it. Then he must learn the Spanish of the Spain of the early 17th century. He goes to great lengths to become an early 17th century writer. He doesn't want to write an homage to the Quixote. He doesn't want to write a parody of the Quixote. He wants to write the Quixote. And guess what? He does it. We're told by our narrator that he has succeeded after many years of arduous study and arduous effort in reproducing some, not in reproducing, in creating some passages, I keep making a mistake, passages from the Quixote. And so let's look at what he does. When you get, we're given an example. What we're thinking, oh, this is so interesting, let's see what he's done. And we get two passages at the top of 43, and this is where the joke, I mean, it's really it's a serious joke. Basically, this is a parable about modern writing. What do you do if you're postmodern? What do you do if the great works have already been written? Do you try to become your precursor? What do you do? So, we're going to figure out. He's going to tell us. Top of 43. It is a revelation to compare Menard's Don Quixote with Cervantes's. The latter, for example, that is Cervantes, wrote, Part 1, Chapter 9, Truth whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present and the future's counselor. Written in the 17th century, written by the lay genius Cervantes, this enumeration is a mere rhetorical praise of history. Menard, on the other hand, writes, Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present and the future's counselor. Did you go and compare the two passages? Now, where's the difference? Where's the difference? It says, on the other hand, Menard much more brilliantly writes, but it's exactly the same. But listen to what he says. He says, the passage is the same, but it doesn't mean the same thing in the 20th century. Just history, the mother of truth. The idea is astounding. Menard, a contemporary of William James, late 19th, early 20th century, William James, brother of Henry James, the novelist, does not define history as an inquiry into reality, but as its origin. You see, in the 20th century, to say that history is the mother of truth is something quite different than to say it in the 17th century. Historical truth for him is not what has happened, it is what we judge to have happened. A very modern notion. Cervantes wouldn't have had that notion. The past is the recounting of certain facts. He says, but when you say that same phrase in the 20th century, what you mean is now that history is what we judge to have happened. The final phrase, exemplar and advisor to the present and the future's counselor, are brazenly pragmatic. The contrast in style is also vivid. That's absurd. They're the same words. The archaic style of Menard, quite foreign after all, suffers from a certain affectation, not so that of his forerunner who handles with ease the current Spanish of his time. Then we get the Borgesian shrug. There is no exercise of the intellect which is not in the final analysis useless. A philosophical doctrine begins as a plausible description of the universe. With the passage of the years, it becomes a mere chapter, if not a paragraph or a name, in the history of philosophy. In literature, the eventual caducity, everybody look that up, right? Worn outness, is even more notorious. The Quixote, Menard told us, was above all an entertaining book. Now it is occasion for patriotic toast, grammatical insolence, and obscene deluxe editions. Fame is a form of incomprehension, perhaps the worst. So he's contemplating what happens to books over time. They become monuments, right? But some monuments we love. He's not saying that the masterpieces are now to be thrown away, but he's saying that it changes over time. The relation of the book to the audience, to the meaning of the language, and so forth. There's nothing new in these nihilistic verifications. What is singular is the determination Menard derived from them. He decided to anticipate the vanity awaiting all men's efforts. He set himself to an undertaking that was exceedingly complex and from the beginning futile. He dedicated his scruples and so forth. Look to the last paragraph. There's another famous Borgesian line here in the last paragraph. And it's a technique, the new technique for writing, he says, and it's exactly Borges' own technique. Let's look at it. Menard, perhaps without wanting to, has enriched by means of a new technique the halting and rudimentary art of reading. This new technique is that of deliberate anachronism and erroneous attribution. This technique, that's what Borges does, deliberate anachronism and erroneous attribution. He makes up sources as well as citing them. It's always a question. There are dictionaries of Borges. One of my acquaintances, an English woman, has written a dictionary of Borges where you can look up and see, is it real or did he fabricate this reference, this image, this whatever. So this deliberate anachronism and erroneous attribution. This technique, whose applications are infinite, prompts us to go through the Odyssey as if it were posterior to the Aeneid, and the book of Le Jardin du Centaure of Madame Henri Bachelier as if it were by Madame Henri Bachelier. Remember where he's accusing her of plagiarism. It makes us read books in a different way, even as if this woman had actually written the book she pretends to. This technique fills the most placid works with adventure. To attribute the Imitatio Christi to Louis Ferdinand Céline or to James Joyce, is this not sufficient renovation of its tenuous spiritual indications? Imitatio Christi, an ancient text, but I'm not sure, or an old text, I'm not sure about it, but to attribute it to a modern writer, does that not make it more interesting? So whereas Cervantes struggles to make the distinction between history and poetry, truth and fiction, Borges deliberately mixes the historical and invents data. The real and the imagined shade into each other. So it's an interesting passage that he's chosen to give Pierre Menard to rewrite, because it's this problem of the relation of history and poetry. So I don't know whether you like that story. I see that you're looking a little passive out there. I won't say bored, surely not. Does anybody want to comment on this? Is this, yeah, Chris, would you push your button? Yeah.
It's really neat because here he is, saying, this guy's going to go back and he's going to intentionally do what most authors try not to do.
Yeah, copy.
Yeah. Or do and try and get away with.
Yeah.
And then in the end, he's saying that there's plagiarism of a text that doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. So therefore, he's kind of using our modern interpretation of history as being told, mm-hmm. and telling it wrong, to realize how much trust we're putting into something that we shouldn't trust so holistically as the mother of truth.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And then on top of that, like, mm-hmm. his whole metafiction and his turning inward and realizing the limitation of its art itself is maybe a means of like trying to create the South American genre itself.
Yeah.
And trying to step away from its precursors. It seems to be the whole motif of the book.
Yeah, well, he has a special relationship to precursors, doesn't he? I mean, if we aren't reading one called Kafka and his precursors, but basically what he's doing is subverting his universalizing impulse would seem to be the opposite of Carpentier, for example, where he's saying magical realism is a Latin American phenomenon because we have cultures in a certain way and that makes us magical realists. Borges would seem to be universalizing and saying, look, the universal history is a handful of metaphors, and then we end up with Pascal, a Frenchman. So he seems not to be local in that way. But I think he is local, as you're suggesting, in that for him, the state of Argentine letters in the 20s was derivative, he felt. Of course there'd been great Argentine literature, gaucho stories, and a great poem about Martín Fierro and so forth. There'd been an Argentine literature, but he felt basically that Argentines were too dependent upon Europeans. That's much too simply put, because look at himself. He knew the European tradition. His mother was English, grandmother was English. He was very proud that he read Cervantes in English before he did in Spanish. He always loved speaking English and was proud of his English origins. So it wasn't that he was dismissing Europe, but what he was really doing was trying to invent a new theory of originality, if you want an original. And he says, look, there's no new ideas under the sun. There's no new text under the sun. What we can do is creatively rewrite. Or what we can do is annotate books that, he says, all of my fictions are just footnotes to other books, he says. So it's a kind of postmodern position, I think, before the letter. I mean, this 1944, it was before anybody was talking about postmodernity. But postmodern, one of postmodernity's concerns is what it means to be post. And you're after something, but you're not quite yet something else. And so the issues of originality, the issues of recuperating the past, as being original by not trying to be original. So that's Pierre Menard is, you would think, the opposite of original, and yet he's celebrated for being incredibly innovative. So it's a kind of discussion, I think, an ongoing discussion in Borges's work about where the modern Argentine writer stands. If you're interested in this topic, you turn to the Argentine writer and tradition. In the same book, which I didn't assign to you, I probably should have, it's one of his most famous essays where he says, look, I can be an Argentine writer and not write about gauchos, and not write about mate, and not write about the pampas. He says, you know, the world is our patrimony. So he's trying to get away from the local color tradition where you have to write about, then he says, there are no camels in the Quran. He says, wrong, there are. there are, but he's trying to make the point that something so familiar doesn't need to be described because it's part of the world that you occupy. So he was someone who had a life, I think in the 20s when he began writing, he wrote 3 books of poetry and 3 books of essays that he had banned during his lifetime. He wouldn't ever allow them to be reprinted. During the 20s, he's looking for his genre. By 1935 only, he publishes his first little fictions. So he's someone who had the luxury, if you want. I mean, he worked in a library. He became he had a family that supported him. He had his lifetime to find his métier, find his genre, and he invented these little fictions that really now are his. I mean, the sphere of Pascal, you're not going to read someone else's little thing like that. It's not quite fiction, it's not quite essay, it's fiction, it's Borgesian. The thing I haven't mentioned to you is that he in about 1955, he went completely blind, which for a reader, imagine, and a writer. He continued to write after that. He went back to poetry more in the 60s. But he did also write fiction. He had a translator and friend named Norman Thomas de Giovanni. The late volumes you will find are translated by him. And he got Borges back up and running because he, really in the late 50s, he after his blindness became complete, he was losing his vision for many years. His father had the same degenerative eye disease that Borges had, so he knew from a young age that his sight was going to conk out on him, and it did. So, but he lived until I believe 89, or sorry, I didn't look up his death date, but I will. Maybe early 90s. He died in the end in Geneva. For some reason, he went for his very last years to Switzerland. But he's worshipped by Argentines. He's their national treasure, as Colombians worship Garcia Marquez, who is theirs. A big difference, really, with Borges is he always lived in Buenos Aires. I mean, he spent 5 years of his youth between 1916 and 1921 in Geneva. That's why he went back. His family had gone there. They didn't quite realize there was a war going on. They went to Switzerland, which was, of course, neutral. And then he went back for a couple of years. Then he traveled a lot. In fact, one of my friends on the faculty here met him in Austin when he was giving a lecture in Austin and had a conversation with him. I never did meet him, but when you go to Buenos Aires, if you do, and I recommend that you do, it's a beautiful city, there are maps posted in the neighborhood where he lives showing the spots. I mean, plaques on walls showing the route that Borges would follow from, home where he lived with his mother until he was probably 80. He married unsuccessfully as a young man, and then in his last few years he did marry, but he was very much his mother's son for all of his life. Anyway, so he's a national treasure, and rightfully so. Let's just look at one more, and then you know what? I think what I'm going to do is we won't shift gears today now that you've brought your heavy tome with you. I'm sorry, I get so tired of carrying pounds of books. I'm sure you do too. But we'll do both of the Carpentier essays on Thursday. But let's go through just one more of the stories, and then I'll let you go. Do you want to choose, or shall I choose? Emma Zuntz is unlike most of his stories. It's easy by comparison. It's got a neat little plot twist. It's a terrible story in a way, but it's not the metaphysical musing quite, and it's much more psychological. There's actually a character who seems to have some flesh and blood in her in that story. So I assigned it for that reason. It feels more like the short stories that we're accustomed to. The Garden of Forking Paths is also quite followable, I think. It proposes one of these handfuls of metaphors, the labyrinth, but a narrative labyrinth, right? A book in which each narrative possibility is followed so that it branches out. An impossible thing to do, more possible on the internet. And some of these games, that young men play, I've noticed, maybe young women too, those kinds of video games that allow you lots of possibilities. It's not like a linear plot. That's what he proposes in this Garden of Forking Paths. Everybody got that one, the Garden of Forking Paths? If not, I think it's accessible. Let's just look for the one I wanted to go to, and I will since nobody's stopping me, is to Borges and I. It's a fun little 2-paragraph meditation on selfhood, on the nature of identity, the nature of self-consciousness. 246. One paragraph, except for the last page, the last line is a separate paragraph. Anybody want to speculate about this? Who's read it? And who would like to speculate? Zarla, do you have, just tell us a little bit what occurs to you here. Push your little button for us, will you? No, don't be nervous. I have to stand up here and talk the whole time. You get to talk a little, if you want.
Basically, Borges is talking about the two different sides of itself. Yeah. And the one in which the voice that he's writing. Oh, maybe not, I guess, to the ending. But I guess when I first read it, I thought the voice, the one that's writing, is the one that is the more inward of
yeah,
the
that's
two.
right. I think you could split the selves into internal and external here. Yeah, keep going. Sorry, is that... what is it? What do you do with the last sentence? I do not know which one of us has written this page. Anybody want to do something with that, Zarla? It collapses the distinction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's this other one is this public self, keeps hogging the limelight, it seems. I always see when I read this you can't say story, this piece of work, I always see a little man sort of hanging on to the back of the public figure. Somehow I see this horrible, almost Siamese attachment or somehow unnatural attachment because this inner self is so unable to come out, it seems, doesn't it? It seems like a psychological parable to me, of self-consciousness. We all have to be self-conscious is to divide oneself. I think about myself doing something stupid yesterday. I think about myself. I say, oh, Lois, you shouldn't have done that. Well, who's the you and who's this Lois? But to think about ourselves, we have in a way, to divide ourselves. To think about our past, we have to think about our past selves. So there's something here that is a parable of everyone's interiority. And it's also a parable of how, I mean, I'm standing up here being a teacher at the same time. Maybe I'm thinking I've got to run home and speak to my editor, which I do. So there's always this sense of the outside and then the inside. So he makes a parable of it, and it's quite, I think, quite effective. Let's just look at it together here. We have a few more minutes. We'll just read a few of the lines. The other one, the one called Borges, is the one things happen to. I walk through the streets of Buenos Aires and stop for a moment, perhaps mechanically now, to look at the arch of the entrance hall and the grill work on the gate. I know of Borges from the mail, and I see his name on the list of professors or in a bibliographical dictionary. I like hourglasses, maps. See this little sweet interior eye, or the guy riding on the big guy's back somehow. I like hourglasses, maps, 18th century typography, the taste of coffee, and the prose of Stevenson. He shares these preferences, but in a vain way that turns them into the attributes of an actor. It would be an exaggeration to say that ours is a hostile relationship. I live, let myself go on living, so that Borges may contrive his literature, and this literature justifies me. It is no effort for me to confess that he has achieved some valid pages, but those pages cannot save me, perhaps because what is good belongs to no one, not even to him, but rather to the language and to the tradition. There is that theme we were just talking about. This rejection of the modern notion of originality, the modern notion of genius. We're part of a tradition. He's always investigating that tradition, whether it's the tradition of Pascal's sphere or the tradition of the Icelandic sagas, which he also loved. He had very odd and idiosyncratic tastes at times in literature. So I underlined that sentence myself. Besides, I am destined to perish definitively, and only some instant of myself can survive in him. Little by little I am giving over everything to him, though I am quite aware of his perverse custom of falsifying and magnifying things. Erroneous attribution and deliberate anachronism and erroneous attribution. He's referring to it there. Spinoza knew that all things long knew that all things long to persist in their being. The stone eternally wants to be a stone, and the tiger a tiger. I shall remain in Borges, not in myself, if it is true that I am someone. But I recognize myself less in his books than in many others, or in the laborious strumming of the guitar. Years ago I tried to free myself from him and went from the mythologies of the suburb to the games with time and infinity. But those games belong to Borges now, and I shall have to imagine other things. Thus my life is a flight, and I lose everything, and everything belongs to oblivion or to him. I do not know which of us has written this page. It's the final line that's just fabulous, because you see that this interior self is nonetheless a part of this printed page. So it's a nice contemplation of selfhood and of creativity, I think. Okay, do bring your heavy book on Thursday, and we will read both of Carpentier's essays. There will be a quick quiz on those essays as well. I hope so.
Oh, yeah.